Are Nintendo's prices on Nintendo Switch 2 hurting the sales of their games? In this video, we're going to look through some of the first-party game prices on Switch 2, look at how Nintendo might view things, how the consumer might view things, and how the development partners also might have their own perspectives. We're going to look at the various things that are going to impact on their margins, and we're going to consider some alternative strategies that Nintendo might approach rather than going straight for price cuts, and we're going to look for the implications for the future if Nintendo stay on this course. So let's start out with a quick overview of the different prices that we have in this variable pricing arrangement. First of all, we have the $80 tier, which includes, of course, Mario Kart World, many of the Nintendo Switch 2 editions, including Tears of the Kingdom, and Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave, although I've put an asterisk next to it because, of course, it also has a digital version, which is just $70. Then we have the actual $70 games, and of course we have Donkey Kong Bonanza, Mario Tennis Fever, Kirby Air Riders, Pokemon Pocopia, and yes, Yoshi and Mysterious Book if you buy it physically. Then we have the ones which are $65, Animal Crossing, $60, Star Fox and Splatoon Raiders, and $40 with Rhythm Heaven, all of these referring to the physical editions, although of course Star Fox and Splatoon Raiders do have $10 cheaper versions. Now, from the consumer perspective, the price is obviously a particularly significant metric. It's something that people are particularly conscious about during a time of some economic worries, and although Switch 2 owners are, by dint of even owning the system, going to be less price sensitive than average, that is to say, if they're buying an expensive console, they probably might be more willing to buy some slightly more expensive games as well. It's nevertheless quite a hardship if they've stretched to buy a console and now are looking at some pretty pricey games, especially when there are lots of cheaper options on the market, particularly on the indie scene. Now, for consumers as well, marketing can have a big impact and property buzz can. So things like the Mario movie can have an impact, and all the buzz around Star Fox surely didn't hurt it. Review scores and goodwill can encourage purchases, but also they can have the opposite effect, as we saw with the rather muted reaction to Metroid Prime 4 at launch. And of course, one thing that's underrated is that if people enjoyed previous titles in the series, they may feel that new ones are for them, whereas if they had a more mixed reaction, such as, for example, to Yoshi's Crafted World, they may feel less inclined to immediately jump onto a new title. In effect, Nintendo are competing with themselves, but they're also relying on their past reputation in order to propel them forward, and if their last game was not quite good enough, then it's going to be a bigger uphill battle to win back fans to that particular series. Now, Nintendo's perspective is obviously going to be quite different. They have reasons to pursue high prices and to pursue lower prices in different contexts. Higher prices are good for them because they protect the value of their key properties. Lower prices, on the other hand, can incentivize people to try new properties, and that allows them to build long-term and even multi-generational relationships with their consumers. Remember, Furukawa and Miyamoto, both in a recent investor presentation, talked about the importance of those very long-term associations with fans. So getting people on board with games now can be paying dividends for them years, perhaps decades into the future. It also means that they can link price to objective metrics and see exactly what is happening. So they can look at historic review score, they can look at the hours played for a particular series, and if they do this and do it credibly, then this is likely to keep consumer relations in a good place. If they can justifiably say, well, look, Mario Kart has squillions of hours played in it, and therefore it is a little higher priced, whereas Star Fox is a game which people do put quite a lot of hours into, but not quite to the same degree, so we've dropped the price. They haven't quite gone exactly that far, but that's the general mood music that they're going with, and that seems to be having at least some cut-through. They would also like to have the latitude to offer discounts and or to weather inflation in due course, so obviously pitching at a higher price out of the gate does mean that they have that flexibility, whereas if they drop the price too quickly, it empties the options box for the future. They also are going to plan to sell these over years and potentially decades. We're very soon going to be entering games that are 10 years old on the Nintendo Switch, and that shows no sign of slowing down, so I could well believe that Switch 2 titles will be sold on current hardware 10, maybe 20 years from now. Also, marking up games shields hardware prices which are entry points for consumers. So we know that the situation with hardware is quite volatile at the moment, and generally speaking, Nintendo try to defray those costs elsewhere rather than do a straight markup. So for example, we saw the marking up of ancillary hardware such as the Switch Joy-Con and such like, but they may find that it's better to try to mark up some of the games, at least for the short term, knowing that they can always bring those prices down in the long term if and when things are a little bit more propitious for them, rather than hitting the hardware, which is obviously going to damage their total install base. The idea being that once people have the hardware, they're likely to buy some software as well, even if it's at a slightly slower pace. Now, one further thing we need to consider is that for many titles Nintendo have on the Switch 2, they actually have an older version on Switch 1, which is cheaper. They have an older Mario Kart, an older Metroid Prime, an older Mario Tennis, and an older Yoshi. And for Nintendo, if people end up purchasing an older title, well, that's not really any different to them in terms of the value than it is if they purchase a new one. If someone spends $60 buying Mario Tennis Aces instead of $70 buying Mario Tennis Fever, well, yeah, they'd probably rather people bought the newer game and were promoting that, but it's still a good sale and it's pretty much as close to the full cost of the new game anyway. And of course, by promoting Tennis Fever, it's going to draw people's attention to Mario Tennis and therefore potentially to Aces. It's maybe not ideal, but it is something that they can do to leverage their library. And I'll be interested to see if any data emerges on the impact of raising the profile of these particular franchises on past games in the series. My guess is that there will be a small but still fairly significant fillip to these older titles from a newer title being released, particularly if people decide to go for the budget option, and essentially these have become the light versions of the games that are currently on the Switch 2. Now, there are many questions which we will not be in a position to answer, but Nintendo may well be from their data. We don't know, for example, if the sales velocity of all first-party titles is dropping, or whether it's just the Switch 2 titles which seem to be moving at a slightly slower pace than the original Switch era. We don't know, for example, how the use of Nintendo Switch Online factors into this, or the Switch 2 editions, or the DLC. We can have the headline numbers, but beyond that is all a little bit murky. Is the proportion of playtime also moving towards third parties, which would suggest that Nintendo is no longer capturing the audience? Well, the headline figures suggest that it probably isn't, but nevertheless, it might be something that Nintendo keep an eye on. And are the average purchase prices of games changing? So we know people are buying games, but what are they actually paying for those games? We would expect on Switch 2 those prices to be going subtly up because the trend of the prices is going subtly up, but perhaps people are sticking with cheaper, older titles and therefore not buying the major new games. Now, there's a certain amount that we can draw from current data, but fundamentally it's all a bit vague to know for sure. These are the kinds of things that Nintendo themselves will be drilling into. Now, before we move past Nintendo, we should also consider the perspective of some of the developers who are not Nintendo. Specifically, HAL and Intelligent Systems are relatively small companies. These are the people behind Kirby and Fire Emblem. They're less able to risk hitting their cash flow by dropping the price, even if it means potentially a longer term success. And so my hunch is that these people particularly would be more cautious about having lower prices for their games, even if it would push their titles into the mainstream a little bit more. Nintendo can run that risk with something like Star Fox or Splatoon Raiders, but I don't think the Fire Emblem team are going to want to do that. We should also consider, of course, the overall margins that these games are operating on. Now, this is a very, very rough model. But let's take a few assumptions. Let's say roughly, I know it's not exactly, but roughly 50% of sales are digital. Let's assume that there's a flat $15 manufacturing cost for the Switch 2 game card, and there are lots of various reports over the years giving different figures, and there have probably been cheaper ones now, but let's use the $15. It doesn't really matter because this is just a very, very rough illustrative model. Then let's assume a 20% retailer margin, which is fairly standard. Then also let's assume that there's $5 in there for breakages, logistics, all that kind of stuff, and a $5 flat digital cost for infrastructure and maintenance and all the other kinds of things that they need. I doubt it's that much, but there might be other things to consider with running a digital storefront. Let's assume that advertising is not being counted because that's a pooled expense that Nintendo will pay for. And let's also count digital and physical prices as equal for the purposes of this illustration. All of those caveats said, I think we can hypothetically say very roughly that the amount of profit they get from each game at each price would be this. For $80 titles, I think they're getting probably about $60 back on average. Obviously, it's going to be more if it's digital, less if it's physical, but that's the kind of a rough ballpark we're looking at. And it goes down. Obviously, for $70, it's more like $50, and so on. So what this shows is that each $10 price cut is reducing Nintendo's margin by about 15 to 20%, because of course, although there are some things that will scale with the price, there are also a lot of costs which are just fixed costs and which they just have to bear and deal with. So what does this mean? Well, for one thing, it's worth pointing out that actually, when you take into account the different margins, actually Nintendo are selling their games, if anything, slightly cheaper than they were only a few years ago. So in 2019, Fire Emblem Three Houses retailed for $60 American. Its game card probably cost about $5 to produce, and today its price is about $78 in real terms, and it had about 4 years of development time as far as we can tell, with the developers telling Famitsu that they started work on it around 2015. In 2026, Fire Emblem Fortune's Weave is coming out. We don't know exactly what the cost of the game card is, but it's probably a bit more than $5, and it's $80 physical, just $70 digital, and it's had 6 possibly years development time. It might be less than that, of course. It depends how much effort was put into the game prior to the release of Fire Emblem Engage, but since we have fairly decent evidence that that title was locked in 2021, and since the credits suggest that not everybody from Three Houses went over to Engage, I suspect that the game has been at least in some form of development since Fire Emblem Three Houses was wrapped up, and so 6 years is a pretty safe bet. So they've probably spent a lot more on it. They're probably selling it for, in real terms, slightly less, and therefore you could imagine this factoring into Nintendo's perception of how they want to approach the pricing. Now, this means that they need to think about how exactly they are going to handle a market that is a lot more cautious about higher prices at a time when they want to maintain those prices. Now, part of that is just a waiting game. They need to think, if they do drop a game price by $10, would it increase sales by 18%? And therefore justify and pay for the extra cost? Well, in some cases that might be the case. You can imagine for Splatoon Raiders, for example, them easily being able to make the case that if they dropped it by $10, they would not only get extra sales in the short term, but also would bring more people onto the Splatoon franchise and therefore into the fold of Nintendo fans for the longer term. Also, they need to consider, would it just bring forward sales that would have been made anyway? If instead of buying games on day one, people buy them at the end of year 2. Well, obviously it's ideal if people buy games sooner, but it doesn't necessarily make a critical difference if people are still ultimately buying them anyway, especially if in the meantime they decide to try some of the older titles, the older versions of the same kinds of games. They also have to consider, would releasing a game at a lower price cannibalize the sales of the other cheaper editions of the same series already on the hardware? So for example, Metroid Prime Remastered is significantly cheaper than Metroid Prime 4. If they drop the price of Prime 4, well, many retailers have done so anyway, but if they decided to do that from the top, would that just send the message that people might be buying that game instead of Remastered, when Remastered is a title that they still have designs to sell? Same with Crafted World, same with Tennis Aces. Now, I think there are particular strategies that we can see Nintendo trying out. These are so-called stalking horses. These are ways of trying things on the quiet just to see what happens and to see what shakes loose. So for one thing, we'll see new and more targeted ad campaigns, and that's the kind of thing that we would always see. We'll also see some more types of cross-promotion, different types of approaches to pushing these properties. So the Donkey Kong Challenge, Mario's 40th, all of these are examples. I also think in more subtle ways, putting Fire Emblem right in the middle of what will almost certainly be a Zelda 40th push is a very canny way to raise the profile of Fire Emblem in the West. Zelda is a very American-focused franchise. It is almost as American-focused as Metroid, in fact, and putting Fire Emblem into that mix is quite a smart bit of counter-scheduling, I would suggest, because a lot of people might be interested in picking up a major, expansive fantasy-style title off the back of a renewed Zelda enthusiasm. They also are doing game demos for a lot of different titles, including Mysterious Book, and of course they want to leverage word of mouth and push the titles with lots of things on Twitter and game chat and such like. They also want to cross-sell related cheaper products. So yes, they may be trying to push Yoshi's Crafted World, Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, as well as Yoshi and the Mysterious Book and Mario Kart World. That's not immediately evident in the way they're promoting things, but my guess is that they will be looking at pushing them in subtle ways nevertheless, perhaps through the use of their recommendations through the eShop or other approaches. They also want to maintain and build the profile of these games, so we will see a steady drumbeat of patches of DLC, and perhaps over a longer period of time. It was pointed out that Mario Tennis Fever had its first major DLC quite a bit later than Mario Tennis Aces did, and I could imagine them deciding to keep these games ticking along over a much longer period of time than they did in the past. Particularly in 2018, they really needed to have updates because they simply didn't have very much on the schedule, but in 2026 they have a lot of different games, and so it's not nearly as urgent to keep pushing DLC and to keep pushing Mario Tennis into the spotlight. If they were to drop small updates throughout 2027, it would just be extra opportunities for people to jump on board. And of course, they also want to keep trying new strategies, because only by experimenting and trying different things are they going to discover a way to push people into getting some of these purchases and making connections with the Switch 2. And the more people buy, the more people might soften towards the prices, plus background inflation will be such that eventually these will become more normalized over time. Now, the implications of this is that there are some properties that will continue to have higher prices. So Mario, Zelda, Animal Crossing, the very core and successful established properties. I also think collabs with other groups, such as Fire Emblem and Kirby, will also tend to be more likely to have higher prices. I count Pokemon in that bracket as well. I also think there's a certain category of games, Famicom Detective Club, and I suspect Advance Wars is an example of this, with Advance Wars 1+2 Reboot Camp retailing at $60. These kinds of titles are pretty niche, they have quite narrow audiences, and so the way you make back money on them is by charging a significant amount, because ultimately the dedicated players will buy them. Now, I will say, obviously, Famicom Detective Club is a lower price than full price, but it is a relatively small game, and I personally think Advance Wars has so much potential gameplay. I've got well over 100 hours in it just on the Switch, and I highly recommend it, but nevertheless, it is something where they're unlikely to take the approach they took with Star Fox, because it probably doesn't have the same potential to grow. Now, in terms of lowering prices, they're going to be looking for those titles which really do have breakout potential. Star Fox obviously has those iconic characters, and while in the past it hasn't been enormously successful with the movie and with the new graphical abilities of the Switch 2, perhaps there is a chance for it to do something pretty big over the long term. Splatoon also is a very young property, and Donkey Kong is one that has always seemed to be a little bit underestimated, and so you can imagine why they would want to push these. Now, Donkey Kong, of course, did retail at $70 for Donkey Kong Bonanza, which is pretty steep, but it's not the very top of the tree. On the other hand, you had Donkey Kong Country Returns at $60 for the dear old Switch, which is on the high side. But then if you look at Donkey Kong Country, that is a game which has much more of an appeal to the older audience, to people who are established Donkey Kong fans. Bonanza was trying something new, and so it's pushed out at, I would suggest, a slightly lower price than Nintendo might otherwise have done for a game of such high effort. There are also titles which have the potential to break out, so Metroid Prime and Star Fox. That's not to do with their growth potential, but just to do with the fact that those particular games have a strong appeal, and so they want to get people talking about them and playing them, and I think that was probably the logistics behind giving a $40 price tag to Metroid Prime Remastered back in the day. Hopefully, in their minds, they might have had another Breath of the Wild type breakout moment, but sadly, it wasn't to be, although it is a terrific game. Then there are properties with more casual or price-sensitive audiences, so of course Switch Sport tended to have a lower price, and we also have games which are positioned to benefit from the tailwinds of other initiatives. So I've talked about Star Fox after the Mario movie and Fire Emblem after the Zelda announcements, which are sure to happen in September, But in any event, there are other things that Nintendo do, and so if they have games which they think have a particular purpose, then they can position them in that way. They also want to maintain that price buffer compared to the older titles so that they always have a main prestige Switch 2 title and a Switch title to complement it at a slightly lower price if people are interested in trying a slightly lower stakes version of the same property. At any rate, I think this is roughly where Nintendo are at present. Now, if you would like to see more, please do consider checking out the Patreon for early ad-free and exclusive content. Otherwise, I'll just say thank you so much for watching, and I will look forward to seeing you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.